Hello, good evening, everybody. I hope you're all doing well. My name's Chris Brown. I'm the producer of Radicals in Conversation, the monthly podcast from Pluto Press. And I'm really happy to welcome you all tonight to this evening's event with Lola Olufemi, Ben Tippet, and Dawn Foster. Now, for those of you who don't know, this event was originally due to take place at Foyle's Charing Cross. So it's a real shame that we can't be there tonight in that really lovely bookshop. But I'm pleased nonetheless that this is going ahead via this live stream on YouTube. Some of you may also know already, but this event is part of a larger program of online events called Radical May. And this is a really exciting new collaboration between Litoral, a radical festival of books and ideas in Barcelona, and dozens of radical publishers literally all around the world. And the idea behind Radical May is simple. So with the ongoing pandemic, it's more important now than ever to think about and to discuss the ideas that are going to bring about the profound transformations that our societies need. And so for the rest of the month of May, there's going to be a program of roundtables, talks, and debates aiming to do just that. So if you check out the description in the video below, there's a link to the full schedule. And we want as many people as possible to take part in Radical May. So do share the links with your friends, your networks. The hashtag is Radical May. And one final shout out from me before we get underway. So Pluto Press recently launched a Patreon page. The global lockdown, as you might imagine, is posing a real threat to independent radical publishing like ours. But we think that our books and our authors are needed now more than ever. So if you like what we do and you want to support us, then you can sign up as a patron from just £3 a month. Some of the membership benefits include free ebooks, exclusive online content and merchandise, discounts on our website, and a whole lot else besides. So after tonight's event, do head over to patreon.com/Pluto Press and check it out. Anyway, we're really pleased to have Lola Olufemi and Ben Tippet with us today, as well as Dawn Foster, who has agreed to chair the discussion. There's going to be a live Q&A section tonight as well. So if you want to put any questions to either speaker, then you just have to pop that in the live chat on YouTube, and then that'll get fed through to them via Dawn. So anyway, thanks for tuning in. And I'm now going to hand over to Dawn, who's going to introduce Ben and Lola properly.
Hi, thanks everyone for joining us in this very unusual setting now. You're in my living room, a couple of other people's living rooms, and I'm sure we're broadcasting to you there as well, rather than sitting in a bookshop, alas. But I'm really, really delighted to actually have the opportunity to be here, having read both of these brilliant books. I think what's really important about this series is the fact that over the last 5 years, most of the political discourse in this country has been really heavily focused on Brexit, but also this ongoing kind of culture war that is whipped up by the right that focuses very, very distinctly on middle class issues. Rather than what's going on around us. We're 10 years deep into austerity. We still have lots and lots of issues around class, around race, around gender that aren't really getting resolved. And it's really, really fantastic to be able to read these two great books that focus on all of these issues very, very keenly. So very, very pleased to introduce Lola Olufemi, who is a Black feminist writer from London. She's an organiser. She facilitates workshops on feminism and histories of political organising for schools, universities, local community organising groups. And she's the author of Feminism Interrupted, Disrupting Power, which is a really, really bold, radical call to seize feminism back from cultural gatekeepers and return it to its radical roots. I had an online book group that read this recently, really, really loved it. And we're also joined by Ben Tippet, who's brilliant here, and he's an educator, activist and writer. He's currently writing a PhD at the University of Greenwich, which looks at the causes of wealth inequality, which I'm very interested in. And he is a researcher for the Transnational Institute and has written for loads of great organisations like Novara, Strike and Labour List. And he's the author of Split, Class Divides Uncovered, which looks into the deep-rooted economic inequalities in the UK and that shape our lives and that affect us everywhere. So I'll open the discussion by asking our two brilliant authors, Lola first. First of all, what made you decide to write the book? and can you talk us through your process and what the essential argument is? So Lola, you'll go first.
Thank you, first of all, Dawn, for sharing. What made me write the book? I think this kind of links to the idea of what the argument, in the main argument or the main premise of the book is. I think that what kind of made me think that the argument that I was going to make was important was that, as you said before, we're in a kind of age where we aren't really talking about the key issues in regards to race and gender. And the way that I frame feminism in the book is as a tool or a political lens or a methodology that can help us think about our freedoms and the freedoms of other people. But also, the book was kind of an attempt to, I guess, make an interruption into mainstream kind of feminist discourse in order to argue that living in a neoliberal age, the kind of feminism that we see that emerges from that age really strips feminism as a political methodology of its transformative potential. And if we look back at the genealogies of feminist organizing and feminist practices and histories, we see a real commitment to radical politics, the politics of abolition, the politics of transformation, the politics of resistance and struggle. And I think the way that I kind of, I guess, define neoliberalism in the book is as a series of a set of policies and practices enacted by like governments and NGOs in the last 10 years that have really privatized and individualized the way that we relate to each other and decimated infrastructures of social care through austerity and concentrated wealth upwards. And so I think the feminism that emerges from this particular contemporary moment mirrors that in a lot of ways, in the ways that it takes on that individualizing turn, in the way that it relies on the state and it relies on kind of carceral solutions to think through big issues. And so I guess another kind of thing that I wanted to do with the book was to think about the ways that the people that I organize with on a grassroots level think about issues of the state, border, transmisogyny, sex work, etc., and make the claim that feminism, is related to all of these wider things, even if liberal feminism wants to reduce it to the individual, the body, notions of care, etc. The feminism that I'm interested in is rooted in kind of community and collective struggle. And so I guess I wanted to make that claim in a substantive way and in a way that invites, I guess, younger people or people who are just coming into a set of, into critical thinking, in a way that invites them to think about those big and broad issues without patronizing them.
And just before we go to Ben, can you talk a bit about what led you politically up to the book? So I know that you organised a university before, and just a couple of examples of speaking to people in the community or certain issues that made you think about what you called an interruption to the discourse, and what made you what part of them kind of spurred you onto it?
I think for me, university was a big kind of journey in my I guess journey to radicalization or to thinking critically, because it was there that I really kind of, alongside other student organizers that were doing work around kind of like free education, racism in higher education, anti-marketization, that kind of stuff, sexual violence on campus, etc. It was in those circles that we were really questioning ideas of like equality versus reform, etc. And at the same time, I knew organizers and was doing some organizing, obviously outside of institutions as well. And as I've left university, that's been the primary site of the organizing that I've been involved in. And at a community level, the issues that people are I kind of realized that there was a big divide or a big disconnect between the issues that people were focusing on at a grassroots level and what was seen or what was positioned as the important issue in terms of like liberal feminism or by middle class feminist gatekeepers. And like you said before, those were based around issues of austerity. They were based around issues of basic survival, prison abolition, the police, etc. And so I think I think that a lot of this thinking comes from, or the instinct to present a more radical case, I think comes from a rejection of just thinking about feminism within the bounds of institutions, or just thinking about feminism as related to a specific set of theoretical discourses that don't touch our everyday lives. I think the way that I've seen people use feminism to think through ideas that are happening to them on the ground, no matter their class, no matter their race, etc., that has really, again, kind of reaffirmed the importance of, to me, of feminism as one of the tools you might use to ask difficult questions, but also to organize as a organizing principle for our communities, especially in times like this.
Yeah, and so Ben, kind of same sort of question to you. What led you to write the book? What are your kind of central arguments? But also picking up on what Lola pointed out, which is that when it comes to the mainstream media, when it comes to the kind of neoliberal middle class gatekeepers, issues of class, race, gender are all really, really truncated and kind of really, really minimized. And especially when it comes to class in many respects, it all boils down to whether or not you eat avocados, not your relation to the capital, etc.
Yeah, man, that I if avocado and quinoa relationship to class is like, I don't like, who knows what that's about. I mean, basically, yeah, I wrote the book to kind of tell the story, I guess, of economic inequality in the UK. Like, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we've, like, throughout all of my adult life, it's kind of almost been in the shadow of what happened in the 2008 financial crisis. And now we've just entered into a new crisis, and it just feels like, for the next 25 years, we're going to be defined by these supposedly like once in a generation events. And definitely, like, I became politicized and interested in economics and inequality, I think, a lot to do with the financial crisis and the like the pernicious response of the government, and and also the social movements that came out of that, like the anti-cuts movement and the student movement. But I think the book in a way is, I guess I try, when there's so many different ways to think about class, and I think what's so clear is that, like, class matters. And we see that very clearly when we look at the statistics on it. And I mean, statistics can be a bit dry, but I'll just kind of tell you one that I think really defined the last 12 years, that 12 years between the two crises that I mentioned. So over the last, since 2008, the richest 1,000 families in the UK have tripled their wealth. And this is at a time at which average incomes in the country have completely stagnated. I don't know if you guys saw, but the wages actually only returned to their pre-2008 level only in February this year. So it's basically like we've only just returned to the position of the previous crisis, and now we've gone into another one. And that the fact that you have this you kind of stagnation in the take-home pay that people have, while at the same time the rich just accumulating more and more fortunes, is fundamentally a story of class. But it's one, as you say, Dawn, I guess, it's one that's been kind of hidden by the narratives that we've seen in mainstream politics and mainstream culture, because according to them, it's like, why do the rich get rich? Okay, they get rich because they're the world, they're the smartest, they come up with the best ideas, they come up with the most innovative companies, and in a way they deserve to be they're rich because they deserve to be rich. And actually it's almost more than that. It's like the more they get rich, the richer we become. A rising tide lifts all boats. But as you can see from those two statistics I said, we have the average person in this country has not got rich. And that's the average. If we want to look at those who have really been at the sharp end of the crisis, as we can kind of discuss later. And I know that both of your works, Lola and Dawn, have done so much to, I think, expose. This is really a matter of life and death for people. So that divide, I guess, between those who have wealth and those who have to work for a living. The billionaire Warren Buffett, the third richest man in the world, who I talk quite a lot about in the book, because he's an interesting character, but also he comes up with these really quite kind of pithy slogans that really get to the kind of nut of how sometimes the system works. And he has this kind of line where he says, either you work till you die or you make money while you sleep. And I think that divide is the kind of like start of actually how capitalism creates class in our society. There's a huge amount of people that literally have to work until they die in order for those at the top of our society to make money while they sleep. And I wanted to, so there's this kind of divide, and I think that divide hasn't really been told. It's been hard to get that story of class into the mainstream. As you said at the beginning, Dawn, the theory and understanding of class that we often have is so defined around these kind of culture war narratives, or it's like a liberal metropolitan elite versus a authentic white working class, which is so embedded with concepts of masculinity and whiteness and race. So I think in a way, what I wanted to do with writing the book was to kind of tell the story of the economic divides of class. Not to say that the culture doesn't matter, but kind of bringing in the culture to really show that that narrative that we've been fed around class is a way of just a way of hiding the daylight robbery that's been going on. There's another quote by Warren Buffett that says, there's a class war going on, but it's my class, the rich class, that's waging it, and we're winning. And I think the book is about how that's been done, and hopefully a way in which we can fight back.
So both of you, the kind of, we should have been sat in a bookshop. We should have been there in person. We're not, because of this massive, massive crisis. I mean, how much do you think the coronavirus crisis has essentially pushed a lot of the structural inequalities that we see to the forefront? And how much do you think that it will actually cause even more harm when it comes to a kind of conservative response to the crisis? Essentially, trying to claw back some of that money, it's almost certain we'll have a second wave of austerity. It won't be cause austerity. So, I mean, do you think that the crisis has caused people to look a bit more closely at some of these structural inequalities, like prisons, domestic violence, and how many people are one paycheck away from complete financial ruin, while at the same time there's been so much focus in the media on essentially imagining the only people affected by the coronavirus, middle class people with mortgages who are just having to bake their own bread. So Lola, you can go first.
Such a big question, but I think you're absolutely right in that, like, that it's not as if there's a defined before and after COVID, right? There's only a way that this virus has exacerbated already existing inequities, already existing kind of miseries created by the decimation of infrastructures of social care. And I think what this moment offers us is the ability to be in conversation with people who have never before thought critically about state power, like who have never really questioned the state or never questioned its practices. I think it offers us the ability to pull from the kind of shadows the people that will be left behind when we're talking about who has a claim to a livable life in this country. And those are migrants, people in detention, people in prisons, for whom this government has absolutely no plan for assistance, no plan for help, etc. And I think that there's a way that we might, I think another thing that's really interesting is watching all of these mutual aid groups kind of pop up and deciding amongst ourselves what is going to happen to these groups when things return to normal, right? And I think it offers us a real chance to build a kind of political consciousness around these issues, to ask people to question the fact that, for example, the government wants survivors of domestic violence to still be able to leave their homes, but in the last 10 years has gotten rid of next to every single access to a refuge or a resource that they might rely on. And so, yeah, I think it gives us the opportunity to expose the really surface level signaling that this government is doing to claim to care about everyone. And I think you're absolutely right that we have to brace ourselves for another part of, any kind of being part of any kind of political project is being realistic about what is going to happen or what might emerge from scenarios like this. And I think another wave of austerity is definitely around the corner, especially seeing the way that this government is, as we speak, narrativizing what is happening, right? In the kinds of information that is available to people, in the way that it's commanding this national spirit and national character of sacrifice for people with close proximity to the virus, and how that all is linked to our sense as citizens that the government is doing the right thing for us as people, right? And that makes it easier to forget all of the people that will be left in the ethers from this kind of virus. And so I think, yeah, there's a lot to, I guess, capitalize on, or a lot to reflect on for those of us who do emerge from this relatively unscathed, or who do emerge from this with the capacity to continue organizing. And I think that starts with igniting in other people the same anger that, you know, was present long before this virus came to the fore, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, obviously same to you, Ben, but I mean, one thing that struck me thinking about class and coronavirus the other day was that in one of the briefings, Matt Hancock said it was great that 49% of people were working from home, which means that 51% of people are still going into work every day. And it seemed as if those people didn't matter. And, you know, listening to the briefing today, it was focused very, very exclusively on NHS staff putting themselves at risk. Been to hospital a lot quite recently. I've been quite ill, and I've seen a lot of doctors and nurses. We know that they haven't had, you know, they've had piddling pay rises, but it really struck me that the cleaners were taking on so much more work, and they were all outsourced. They were all, you know, we know they're on absolutely tiny salaries, and we still have loads of people going into offices and hospitals, cleaning every day, people in supermarkets, people going into prisons and getting really ill, people like my mother going to care homes to work and getting really ill. So, I mean, how much do you think coronavirus has shown how much we rely on working class jobs, and how much do you think it has essentially made them invisible?
It's a really good point. I think that, you know, on the left, we've like said for a while as like a hypothetical experiment, like, as a, you know, when it comes to the question of like what jobs are more valuable than other jobs, and, you know, why are some jobs paid more than other jobs? So like, for example, why is a cleaner paid so much less than somebody who works as a hedge fund manager or a private equity fund manager or something? You know, we've often said it's like a hypothetical experiment. What would you know, let's imagine for a moment what would happen if for some reason hedge fund managers couldn't go to work for, you know, or they all lost their jobs. You know, what would the human impact of that be? And, you know, maybe some people can make a case that this would have some kind of systemic problem to do with the financial economy, and that might be a problem. But I think there's actually a reasonable case to be said to say that the world might be a better off place. Yeah, like, but then when you say, okay, what would happen if all of the cleaners in our NHS hospitals or in any of our institutions or our workplaces or our homes, you know, if suddenly all the cleaning work got stopped, well, the human impact would be obviously undeniable and devastating. And now that, you know, the COVID crisis has literally turned that hypothetical thought experiment into reality. And like, I think it's, on the one hand, it has exposed the fact that this work is essential. You know, and none of the government's essential list of workers across anywhere in the world is a hedge fund manager. But obviously every single one of those lists includes cleaners, care workers, NHS workers, delivery drivers, supermarket workers. So in that respect, it has exposed the necessary labor that keeps the system functioning. And it has, I think, blown out of the water this idea that people are paid according to how productive they are. I mean, like, in a way, that plus then the narrative that you say CEOs in this country are now paid 150 times the average worker in their company, when in the 1980s it was only 20 times. So it's not to do with CEOs are not working 150 times harder today. It's to do with the fact that they've managed to design policies to extract more wealth and income from the rest of society. but I think with this, you know, so in that respect, it's exposed it. But exactly as Lola said, I think this narrative that it's like there's so many narratives that are now coming along to try and dampen that issue, you know, and one of it is this idea that these people aren't necessarily workers; they're kind of heroes, and it doesn't really matter what happens. You know, if bad things happen to them, it's like them doing their duty for the country, rather than the fact that actually a lot of people are doing, you know, a lot of people are doing these jobs because they have to do these jobs, because of the fact that if they don't do these jobs, then they don't have income and money to buy the things that they need to survive. And nobody wants to, well, take the issue of care work, for example. There was a report that came out from, I think, the Resolution Foundation last week that said that over 50% of people that work in our care homes are being paid less than the living wage. And they're obviously massively disproportionately female workers and disproportionately BAME workers as well. And the care homes have become the kind of hidden epicenter of this crisis. I think there's a lot to go into it, but one of the just completely devastating things is the fact that care home deaths are not really being recorded in the official statistics, when if you look at other countries like Spain and Italy, according to their statistics, half the number of people that have died from COVID have come from care homes. So in a way, the fact that these jobs were so undervalued and invisible is now kind of playing into the crisis as we see it now, of course. Like, and that's just one example. We could sit here for hours, I'm sure, and pick out all the ways in which the labour market has made this crisis so much worse, and the ways in which this crisis is potentially going to make the labour market worse. I guess the one thing is to remember that, and this is one of the really important things about thinking about class is, and I guess what Lola says in her book around feminism as well, that, you know, class can also be a transformative project as well. It's not just a system that divides us, it's also social bonds, and it's also kind of a way in which we can organize to overcome these inequalities. And so if you take the issue of care workers, I mean, there's many examples of people going on strike to demand better paying conditions for, you know, that happened. I think even last year, 600 or 700 care workers went on strike in the north of England to fight back against the fact that their care homes were being kind of privatized and bought over by a private equity fund. So, I mean, it's interesting because striking when you're in a care home rather than striking when you're, I don't know, like a coal miner, let's say, are two different things. You know, coal doesn't care if you don't dig it out of the ground, when people do care if you don't actually care for them. So I think there's obviously issues around striking when you're in these industries that make it maybe harder, but not impossible for people to strike. And if you look at the work by people like UVW, the United Voices of the World, the IWGB, who have been organising care workers and cleaners in the NHS to bring them in-house and increase their pay, I think it shows that it can be done.
Can we talk about the media? So, I mean, I think one of the big issues is that I feel as if, you know, Ben was talking earlier, what I think is a really good framing point is the fact that we came from the 2008 economic crisis straight into a decade of austerity, and now we're into another crisis. And it feels as though the media has, we've seen a lot of, you know, smaller publications close down. We've seen publications on the left either become more liberal or, you know, become a lot smaller, and the right-wing press has more and more money flowing into it. I mean, so Lola, what do you think are the main problems that we see in the press, and especially the main tropes that we see when it comes to really truncated reporting about, you know, about feminism and women's rights in the media? Like, I mean, how reductive is it, and what particular things do you find really irritating about feminism in the media?
I think that when we talk about, I guess, gatekeepers, the media is a very kind of potent example of that in terms of feminist discourse, because I think certain publications set the tone for what is seen as an important feminist issue. And I guess what I talk about a lot in the book, and what I'm interested in kind of generally, is how liberal feminism or the concerns of liberal feminism become the defining idea of what feminism is and what it can do and what it should do, right? And so I think in the pages of our kind of mainstream newspapers, we have middle class white women waxing lyrical about a whole number of issues that seem to have no, as if they were universal, but have no kind of general effect on the issues that a large majority of women are facing in the UK. I think on issues around kind of gender, like on issues around trans misogyny, for example, that's another kind of big issue, or another way in which kind of mainstream liberal feminist seemingly feminist publications are able to create a non-existent culture war between trans women and cis women, and pit their concerns against each other as if that is one thing that even exists, when if you go into any kind of local community centre in any failing area in the UK and ask women what their concerns are never about whether trans women can access spaces or swim in the heath. Their concerns are about how to survive 10 after a decade of austerity, and how to rebuild their lives in that ruin, and their reliance on food banks, and the fact that they cannot feed their families and they cannot feed their loved ones. And so I think the media has a big kind of role and responsibility to play in the depoliticization of something like feminism, ideas of feminism, and ideas of class as well. Because if we were going by what they kind of said, we don't have a sense of what is actually happening on the ground to people. And I think what they're good at doing is obscuring the severity of the problem. Because everything, you know, for an ease of publication has to be simple and watered down. And so I think that there's a big bite taken out of potentially what could be quite radicalizing stories, right? When we talk about migration, or when we talk about prisons, for example, the emphasis is always on the personal individual migrant story, instead of the structural inequalities, the systems that frame an individual and limit their access to resource, limit their access to the ability to work in the UK, for example. And so, yeah, I think there are lots of ways in which issues are reduced, they get simplified, and in the end, they don't contribute to any kind of I think often there's a tendency maybe to think of the press as, in the most generous sense, journalism as maybe exposing some of the things that the powerful do to those that don't have power, or to those that are more vulnerable. But if that is the best way that we might think about the potential of that kind of investigative journalism, or that kind of journalism writing, none of that happens, I see, that happens very rarely in kind of mainstream liberal publications, because their concerns are fundamentally different. Or it's easy to dismiss an entire class of women. It's easy to dismiss the nuance necessary to speak about issues like state violence, domestic violence, trans misogyny, etc., when you, one, don't possess the skill, but when you, two, are not invested in improving or relieving the suffering of specific kind of of those who are most vulnerable in society. And I think that that's the difference between a kind of radical feminism and liberal feminism, in that radical feminism is really invested in that suffering, and you know, holds to be true the idea that nobody's pain should go unseen, whereas liberal feminism is okay to relegate people to the realm of the unthinkable for the sake of winning an election, or for the sake of law and policy. They're okay in finding gaps and maintaining those gaps, as long as it fits into a specific and very neat idea of the way the world should be. So for example, on issues of like prisons, the idea, or even like Me Too and sexual violence, the idea is always that there is a singular bad man, and the prison is the response to that singular bad man. And once that person is disappeared, the problem disappears. And that in itself is an indictment of the idea that liberal feminism has no kind of response to the idea that the police officer who is this figure of savior could also be the bad man, could also be the very thing that props up a system that allows sexual violence to continue. And so, yeah, there isn't a sense that these mainstream publications are able to deal with complication in the way that we're going to need them to, and that we've always needed them to.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I was literally about to come back on prisons, because I think prisons are a really good example, and you're brilliant on this, of one of those areas where the media have really truncated the issue, especially around prisons and gender. So, whenever I talk about prisons and gender to people, I always talk about, I volunteer in a prison, and, first of all, almost no women there should really be in prison. There is almost nothing that they have done that means that they are a threat to anybody outside of the prison. It's very, and when you look at the stats on what happens when women are on trial versus men being on trial, you find that the criminal justice system, especially the jury system and judges, are a lot more prejudiced against women, and especially non-white women, than they are against men when it comes to crime. But also, once women get into prisons, they're at very high risk of violence, both from prison guards, but also just like physical violence from the actual space. But also that when women go into prison, their families tend to abandon them, and most the majority of women there don't get visitors, whereas when men go into prison, their families rally around them, try and support them. So it's a really complex issue. So you have the issue of the fact that gender stereotypes, contribute to what happens to women when they're in prison and what happens afterwards when it comes to family and community. But also the legal justice system is very weighted against women, and often the women are in prison for a crime that was done alongside a man. But when it comes to the media, all you actually see is a couple of people claiming that the biggest issue facing prisons is that a trans person may come in pretending to be a woman, which is such a tiny issue that ignores everything. So I wonder if you could come back a bit more on prisons, because it's such a huge and complex issue that gets so underreported.
I think also on the issue of domestic violence, it's really interesting, because the domestic violence bill that was proposed by Theresa May's government, which is somewhere kind of in the process to becoming law. One of the things that it says is that one of the ways, so it proposes this kind of tough on crime approach to the issue of domestic violence, like locking up perpetrators and bringing police to the doors of instances of domestic violence. And like you said, the majority of women who are in prison are survivors of domestic violence. And there are proven links that the more that you invite the state, the more that you invite police officers, the more that you invite those authorities into those disputes, into instances of domestic violence, the more likely it is that women who are survivors end up in prison through no fault of their own, really. And I think the question of prisons, I think the kind of frame that I use in the book is a frame called abolition feminism. And that abolition feminism basically proposes that we might use feminism to build a society, like very simply, we might use feminism to build a society in which prisons are no longer necessary, or at the very least recognizes the harm that prisons do not only to individuals, but to their communities. And so thinking through issues of domestic violence in terms of abolition feminism, for example, it proposes that there might be ways as communities that we might come together and ensure that individuals and women can remain safe and be kind of distance from their perpetrators and abusers as communities, but that we also might encourage the state to make sure that there is some kind of safety net that those women can rely on, right? Because for instance, in this country, women who are experiencing high levels of domestic violence are also more likely to have the least access to monetary resource, right? And if because of universal credit, all of your money is going into the hands of your abuser, you don't have any routes through economic routes through which you might be able to extract yourself from a violent situation, and so you stay. In the same way that if you're in the situation that we're in now, and the government says that you can leave your house to go to a refuge, but all of the refuges around you are underfunded, you're not gonna go anywhere. And so I think what that feminism asks us to recognize is the systems that place in or the systems that trap specific women in violent situations and mean that they're not able to have any routes out to safety. But also, I think more broadly, it asks us to look at the idea that prisons are relatively new inventions, and that there is a big idea that prisons deliver justice. But for example, again, on the issue of sexual violence, if you're a survivor and we know that, number one, a lot of issues for survivors don't even end up going to court. But if you do go to court, you are interrogated, you are asked to prove what has happened to you, etc., etc. The burden is on you to put forward and make a case. That is also a very potentially re-traumatizing situation. And so what abolition feminism kind of argues is that by using transformative justice, by using other methods, we might actually craft ways of justice and accountability that don't re-traumatize survivors and don't simply disappear perpetrators as if they were extractable, already bad individuals, born bad and incapable of changing, right? Because it also recognizes there are so many pressures on us as individuals that shape our understandings and shape the ways that we behave in terms of violence, domination, etc. So again, that's the kinds of complications that that mode of thinking introduces, I guess.
I mean, Ben, I was looking at some stats the other day that pointed out that journalism, well, the media as a whole, is the second most exclusive profession in the UK after medicine. So the vast majority of people are either upper, come from a background that is professional, managerial, or something else, but basically like very, very tiny number of working class people. And that clearly feeds into the way that class is discussed in the media, but also what issues get covered. So, I mean, what do you think are the main issues with how class gets discussed in the media, how it gets truncated into merely kind of cultural rather than structural problems, but also how little coverage there is of austerity and what kind of issues of class have been ignored in the last kind of 12 years to take your time in since the economic crash?
Yeah, there's this kind of culture versus economics definition of class thing is something I go into a little bit in the book. You know, like I think there's so many different ways in which class is kind of used in the media. On the one hand, it's what you said at the beginning, Dawn. It's like, you know, class is defined simply by your tastes and your lifestyle choices. You know, it's literally just like avocado and quinoa versus, I don't know, like chips and something else, like chips and like tea or something. And so there's this kind of very cultural definition of class, and you see the media repeating this all the time. I mean, I think it's probably like at its most obvious and kind of almost like comedic. It's not funny because it's so important, but it's like, how are they actually trying to do this? Is when they try and present someone like Alan Sugar as like a kind of symbol for like the working classes. You know, this is a guy who, you know, was born to a working class family, like an immigrant Jewish family in the northeast of London, but you know, is somebody that is now a billionaire, a member of the House of Lords, has the catchphrase, "You're fired," and yet he's presented as like a working class hero. It's almost like the media like kind of sticking their finger up at the left and being like, we can kind of present this guy as working class. And I think in a way, when class is just purely defined along cultural lines, we can end up to that position. And so, but that's not to say that, you know, culture doesn't matter for class. And actually, to maybe flip the question on its head, there's some really interesting research that shows that actually one of the ways in which the rich and the middle classes and the upper classes managed to take control of elite institutions like the media is through cultural factors. There's these guys, researchers at the London School of Economics, who have this really good book called The Class Pay Gap. And their kind of narrative, they basically went into all of these elite institutions and did this quite extensive ethnographic studies. And one of the organizations they went into was Channel 4. And they looked at how somebody who became a commissioning editor got to the top. And, you know, commissioning editors, I guess, are very important people. You know, they get to decide effectively who, you know, what the nation is going to watch on TV. You know, they decide effectively what will be the narratives, the cultural narratives that the population will consume. And, you know, Channel 4, I guess, has produced stuff like Benefit Street, which has been such, you know, again, this is one of the clear ways in which the media have used class as a really like pernicious idea that like to be working class is to be seen as like vulgar and pathological in society, as a way of trying to kind of disidentify people with their class backgrounds. And, you know, obviously this was very much, I think, the narrative at the beginning of the austerity years. Somebody like Owen Jones and yourself, Dawn, as well, in your amazing book, Lean Out, really, I think, just take that down. And I'd really recommend anyone reading, like going back to those texts, actually, because I got to do while I was researching this book, and I think it's just mad how pernicious that class narrative was. Now I think it's slightly, so basically with these LSE researchers, they were looking at kind of how the commissioning editors got to the top, and they found out that one of the ways that people do it, like this guy they interviewed, he went to private school, he went to Oxbridge, his parents helped him have like a home in London while he kind of navigated the very precarious world of the arts and the media. So there were all these economic things that were there, but what was also important, they said, is their kind of his ability to perform these kind of sets of cultural codes, like the idea of like knowing when to swear in a meeting, knowing when to like put your feet up on the table, knowing what shoes and stuff to wear, stuff that in no way makes you a better commissioning editor, but what it does do is it kind of symbolizes to other people that you're kind of part of the club. And they said that this was a really important way in which those people at the top of society managed to kind of maintain these top professions. And I think you just see that playing out in the statistics with, I think, I can't remember exactly, but it's like roughly around half of newspaper columnists went to private school. And actually, to relate it back to the point that Lola was just saying, I think it's even higher for judges. I think they're one of the top, it's even like 70%. And so the schooling system, I think, is very much one of these things that produces the class divisions that we have in society. Maybe just to kind of to finish, to draw it together, is the fact that, again, one of the things that the schooling system does is it's the biggest predictor about, you know, when people will go to prison as well. I think Akala has the line, the rapper Akala has two, I think, just statistics that really just expose what's going on. The first is the biggest predictor of whether you'll go to prison is if you're expelled from school. And the second is it costs more to send somebody to prison than it does to send them to Eton. And when, you know, 75% or whatever of judges are going to private school, 50% of newspaper columnists are going to private school, and this is like the you know, it could so easily, we could transfer that money and, as Lola said, pay for, you know, to people to sort out their issues in their communities and not kind of throw you know, lock people up and throw away the key. I think you know, this is really where a lot of the kind of problem comes from.
I mean, just before we go to questions to come from the viewers, to come back on that, I mean, do you think there's a big problem in the media that where do you think the idea comes from that all left-wingers are middle class? I mean, I've always thought that part of it is down to the fact that left-wingers tend to advocate kind of more complex ideas, talk about structural inequalities, talk about big ideas rather than just maintaining the status quo. And I remember when I first started writing about this, I was told over and over again in relation to feminism that if you talked about structures of inequality, if you talked about kind of theories of how gender roles, are and gender barriers are built, that working class women wouldn't understand them. And obviously, as a working class woman, that being told this by very, very rich, privately educated people, it didn't go down well. But I mean, where do you think this idea comes from that essentially left-wingers are all middle class? And why do you think there's a lot more pushback against people who come from somebody like Jeremy Corbyn's background, where you're really quite privileged, but you decide to push for policies that help working class, compared to people who come from very, very working class backgrounds, get to a position like Alan Sugar, and then kick down?
Yeah, it's a really good question.
Really big question.
Yeah, no, it's a really important one as well, because obviously what happened in the 2019 general election, was massively framed by this. Yeah, like the left's narrative around class, and I guess the narrative around class that I try and talk about in the book. I don't think that Labour lost the election because they didn't have the right class narrative, but obviously they didn't win a electoral majority with that narrative. There were other things going on for sure, and part of the way in which the right managed to crush them, I think, is with having a different a kind of class narrative based around culture. Not necessarily this is the way that they crush them, but the right's narrative around a liberal metropolitan elite with Jeremy Corbyn versus the like authentic working class, where this kind of concept of authenticity so easily slides into a discussion about race as well. Why is it though? I think, to return to your question, why is it that the left are so like attacked for being, why is it that the image is that they're middle class? I think it's partly because of the fact that what we've seen over the last, not 12 years, over the last 40 years, is the demise in the organized working class. I mean, there's no denying it. Like, trade union density has practically halved in this country, and that's a thing that happened. That this has happened across pretty much every global north country, or most countries in the global north. And that was an articulated class battle, to destroy organized labor. And part of, I think, the class battle, or to bring in that quote I started with by Warren Buffett about the class warfare, but it's the rich that are winning. Part of the way in which they've won is by effectively destroying this idea that class is something that you can kind of, particularly for if you're working class is something that you can organize to build a better life for yourself. And in the book I talk about Billy Elliot actually as a kind of narrative, a kind of moral parable for this, because I also define neoliberalism as, any book these days you have to define neoliberalism in it, as Lola did, and similarly I kind of say one of the defining things is this idea of individual competition. We live in a society and an economy in which we're supposedly individuals competing it out, and to be successful you have to be the most talented and then you win. And Billy Elliot is basically very much this narrative, despite the fact I love the film actually, but like it follows Billy Elliot, who's a talented ballet dancer, and it's set against the backdrop of the miners' strike in 1984. And Billy Elliot basically kind of ends up, I'm going to give it away, so maybe hold your ears if you haven't seen the film. Billy Elliot basically ends up becoming a successful ballet dancer. The last kind of scene is him on stage at like Sadler's Wells, like in Swan Lake or something. So as an individual, he's like succeeded. Well, obviously what happened with the 1984 miners' strike is it was like the symbol of the decline of the organized working class. Like the state used everything in its power to effectively destroy it. And since then, there's this poignant scene where Billy Elliot's dad tries to cross the picket line because he wants to pay for Billy Elliot's ballet lessons, and his brother runs after him and stops him from going, and he's sobbing and he's like, we're finished, son. And it's almost like I don't know, there's so much in that it's like we're finished son is this kind of collective epitaph for the working classes. And so I think part of that whole demise has been this idea that, you know, working class solidarity isn't something that you're going to win by. And if you ever try and do that, then you're going to be massively attacked by the media. You're going to be attacked by the state. That effectively means that any representation of that voice in our mainstream politics, in our media, in our culture has just been kind of silenced. And I think a really good book on this that just came out is by Natalie Ola, called Steal as Much as You Can. And she really documents the way in which these working class voices have been kept out of the mainstream. And I think what happens then is that when you have, you know, when you have who then is left to effectively fight the battle, it's in the Labour Party, it's effectively just a couple of backbenchers who, by a fluke of luck, managed to get onto the ballot. And, you know, it's not really to do with the fact that there was an organised working class movement behind them at the beginning. I think one has kind of developed and built from it. So I think I hope that's kind of answered your question. I'm not really sure if it has.
No, it has, absolutely. So first question from the audience at home is from Tina, and it's a question for Lola. So how can millennial depoliticised women of colour be brought into the fold of a unified radical cause and steered away from consumer capitalism?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question. I think for me, it's interesting because I don't know whether I believe necessarily. I think one of the things that does feminist thinking and feminist practice a disservice, I think, is the idea of like waves, or the idea of a unified feminist movements with no kind of disruptions, or with no dissenting voices, because I think it kind of does a disservice to the idea that, you know, at any given time there have always been a million different people, a million different feminists making claims about what feminism should be from under that mantle. And for me, what the wave kind of analogy does when you learn about feminism in the UK, or learn about feminist thinking just in general, is ignore the kind of dissenting but also radical origins of a lot of Black feminist formations in the 70s and 80s, in terms of the organizing that they did. And so that's, for me, is where I learned about what feminism is and what feminist practice is, from groups like OAD, the Organization of Women of African and Asian Descent, the Brixton Black Women's Group, women like Claudia Jones, Olive Morris, Gail Lewis, Stella Dadzi, those the groups that they were part of, and even American groups like the Combahee River Collective, for example, that came as a precursor to the idea of or defined as a precursor to the idea of intersectionality in their statement, what their principles were. I think they have taught me necessarily how to think about what we should do as feminists. And I think they've kind of warned against, because their groups were rooted in a Marxist, socialist, anti-capitalist politics, they've always warned against the seeming rewards or the seeming benefits of a representational politics that I think most young women get swept up to, not in particular women of color. I think when women in general come to feminism, they come to it through, I guess, a lens that's looking at the body or looking at individual agency, and not so much collective resistance or collective movements. And from that is so closely linked to the idea that representation is a means to success, or is a means to climbing to the top, right? So that feminism becomes about the climbing of certain hierarchical ladders instead of the abolition of them. It becomes about naturalizing other women's pain and suffering and exploitation, so that it becomes a natural part of other women's successes. And so, yeah, I think that there are many ways, but I think the number one way, and what I hope that I've done in this book, is to make the case that if we trace feminist practice and grassroots feminist movements back to their origins less than kind of 2 decades ago, we can see quite clearly that groups and formations working at that time had a very searing critique of capitalism, had a very searing critique of networks of exploitation and the machinery of exploitation, and that was at the core of the demands that they were making. They knew that that was something that shaped their existence in the world as Black women, shaped their experiences of racism, sexual violence, and so on, and shaped the violence that was occurring in their communities. And so, yeah, I think the number one way is to make more known those radical histories, because I think another thing that liberal feminism does really well is obscure what has been put on the line in terms of feminist fights or feminist struggles. There have been feminist struggles that have framed demands made for national sovereignty and independence in terms of colonialism, etc., blah, blah. But what liberalism does, or what that liberal feminism does, is act as if feminism requires not an upheaval, or act as if feminism doesn't require you to risk something as an individual, and to really question what your individual ideas of success are. Yeah, I think of kind of radical poets. There's a poet called Wendy Trevino who has this poem where she basically talks about the idea that we have to question what it is to succeed as an individual in order to collectively succeed. You know, that we won't be able to kind of move forward as individuals if others are left behind. And I think that that's what the task of radical feminism asks us to, or a critical feminism asks us to think about, that nobody can, I guess, nobody can be left behind in our kind of formations of the things that we demand and in the things that we seek to organize for.
Great. So next question is for Ben. Sorry, I'm going to choke. How do we manage generational inequality? So, you know, Matthew Dickinson says you need generations of CEOs before you're as rich as the likes of the Duke of Westminster. So he wants to know, would you advocate for 100% inheritance tax, ending the monarchy, abolishing the Lords and private schools, or, you know, how essentially do you stop generational inequality?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I would say let's go for all of those four things like that. They sounds like a good policy platform, Matt. But the one problem with them, I think, is that they're very actually unpopular. Inheritance tax is one of the most unpopular taxes. I think partly because it's the fact that it's seen as like a death tax. It's seen as like a tax on people when they die, which I guess is not necessarily the right framing of it. So maybe I think a more successful thing, and something that they're definitely trying out a lot more in the US, is ideas of wealth taxes. So these are like very like effectively 90%, 100% marginal tax rates on the stock of wealth, but only when you have only above like quite a high threshold. So it would be, I don't know, like it would stop effectively people like Jeff Bezos or the Duke of Westminster being able to accumulate so much wealth simply by having wealth. Because this is one of the kind of things about wealth and about capital and labor, is the fact that if you're making money while you sleep, you can actually make shitloads more money while you sleep than you can going out to work until you die. Yeah, like the amount of capital income that the Duke of Westminster will be making on his huge portfolio of land in the UK will be astronomical. So definitely we should be having higher tax rates on that stuff. And I think to make the case that this is plausible and feasible, because as soon as you talk about kind of tax and spend, everyone says, oh, but the deficit's going to run away, or oh no, this can't be done. It's like I don't know, economically impossible. Is the fact that you point to, in just 40, 50 years ago, we had top marginal tax rates of, I think, like 97% in this country. So if you were earning in the top bracket, you were effectively taxed everything that you earn. And very similar with inheritance taxes. I think we almost had like close to kind of, I can't remember the exact figures, but it's in the 80% brackets. So this is within the living memory of a lot of people in this country. We had these things. I think on the left, we should be demanding much more though. You know, we shouldn't really get stuck into the tax debate. It's actually, I don't know, it's just fiscally, it's fiscal policy is kind of boring unless you're an economics student. So like much more interesting, I guess, is like, how do we radically transform ownership, like policy making within this country? How do we actually, I mean, there's so many crises that, like, take something like housing, for example. You know, how do we kind of reinvent the like utopian vision that people had in the 30s when they were building some of the most like amazing council houses in the country? You know, how do we imagine space in our cities today that's affordable and transformative and playful for people? Maybe, okay, we could be doing some of the tax stuff to say this is how we're going to fund it, but I think on the left we should really be pushing to kind of say, okay, if we're going to take some of the Duke of Westminster's Belgravia Square, what do we want to turn it into?
Yeah, I think it's really key, essentially what you were saying about the fact that we can keep on going over these arguments that make the front page of the Daily Mail and have done for 10 years, or we can, try and keep alive the spirit of Corbynism and look at new, exciting, radical ways to rethink how we change structures. So the next question is for Lola, and it's from Liam Davis. And Liam wants to know, Lola, do you think there's strength to be found in rooting feminism as radical that can mean different things to different people? Or are there key underpinnings, a key ethos, etc., which need to be there for it to be considered radical?
I think that it's important when you're kind of like making political demands under the banner of, I guess, feminist demands, that you define what you understand to mean as feminism, or kind of any political practice. I think that that's like kind of core to any political project that we're all involved in. But I also think that there's a way that we can be really preoccupied with tension, or preoccupied with like multiplicity, or the idea that there might be several different ways that we're all working towards the same thing, and we can get tied up in knots around this idea that there has to be unity in order for there to be progress. And so I think it's really important to hold tension. It's really important to recognize that broadly on the left, there are going to be a number of different ways people attempt to make their political demands possible. And the task is not to get preoccupied, I guess, interrogating one another, or calling one another in line. It's more to think about how we might use a proliferation of strategies in order to make a collective case or a collective argument. I definitely, obviously, in the feminism that I'm putting forward, I think there are definitely key underpinnings that have to be there in the frame that I'm using. Obviously, a critique of capitalism, a desire to abolish capitalism, a desire to abolish work, and so many different things. But I also think I want to resist a desire to be necessarily prescriptive, because I found in feminism an ease and a flexibility in which to root a specific politics, so that feminism speaks to anti-capitalism. Feminism is about the abolition of borders. It's about rectifying histories of colonial domination, etc. It's connected to ecological crisis, neo-colonialism, all of these things, instead of what liberal, I think, or neoliberal feminism does, which is reduce feminism to a very limited and narrow scope. And so, yeah, I think we can use, because feminism is a lens and a tool, and we're aiming to use it in that way, we can use it to apply it to a critique of so many of the prevailing systems of violence that organize our lives.
Great. So next question is for Ben. So Ben, the fourth industrial revolution will transform production and the economy. What are your thoughts on the intersection of class and technological innovation and digital transformation of the workforce?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that, I mean, we need to remember that like technological innovation is something that is not just happening now. You know, it's happened all the way through the history of capitalism, and each time it's changed class relations, but it's never on its own got rid of class relations. Yeah, and I don't see any reason why it would now. So I guess there kind of can be this technological utopianist idea which says maybe we're heading towards a kind of abundance society, a post-scarce society, in which we'll be able to produce enough stuff to satisfy all of our basic needs, and this will get rid of the ability, the fact that we need to work and stuff. When obviously these things are going to be determined by the power relations that exist in society. It's going to be determined by how strong the working class movement is, how strong the feminist movement is, how strong the anti-racist movement is. So, if let's like kind of think of an example, maybe something based around the stuff that's happening now with COVID. On the one hand, technology is kind of, it's amazing in a sense. Yeah, it's making us all enabled to be locked down and shut down, and we're able to kind of discuss and talk to each other, and it's enabled people to be able to organize even though they're not working. But on the other hand, what you're seeing is everything suddenly going onto these major tech platforms. So all of our social interactions now on these tech platforms, and you're seeing bosses for their workers implement things where if they're working at home, then your boss can monitor effectively when you're working, how much you're working. And so technology is, and in much the same way that in the kind of factories of the past, the clock system was used as a way to kind of extract more and more from people as they worked. Clearly, we can see technology going down that route. So yeah, I guess like in a way, I guess I'm kind of agnostic about it, because I think really the important thing is the political power that then shapes how the technology is used.
Great. Sorry, I'm done. Sorry, I've got that again. I remember reading a friend's essay. I'll try and dig it out and tweet it about how the term Luddite had been really misused, and about how there was actual really interesting history of Luddism and what actually happened. So I'll try and dig that out and tweet it.
Oh, nice. That'd be good.
Next question is for Lola from Nancy. What's your comment on this statement from Bell Hooks? Feminist movement has not created sustained feminist revolution.
I think I assume she's talking about in the context, in the ways that feminist movements, I guess, have been institutionalized. So I guess that's my understanding. So I'll go from there. I guess, yeah, there are specific ways in which, again, I think it comes back to this idea of defined feminist moments or defined feminist waves that I guess are talked about only in the realm of law and policy. And I think that what that does is reduce the scope of what is possible under a feminist banner. But I also think it disallows us to think about feminism in a broader and more transformative sense. I think it makes it easy for parts of feminist movements to become institutionalized, and so NGOs are set up, or people see a specific route to feminist progress to be through institutions or to be through specific organizations, and those organizations or those systems and institutions can kind of stunt a more radical tendency that feminist revolution might bring us. And I think that there's a fine kind of line to draw between understanding that we can use law and policy strategically to advance non-reformist reforms, to really sorry, I was just reading to think seriously about the ways that we might in the short term relieve suffering or misery for people, but that we don't get kind of caught up in the state project or in the organization or institutional project as the be all and end all of the things that we demand. I think Sisters Uncut have a really great way of thinking about the state in that they say, I think you think in with and beyond the state. And I think that it's about using those three kind of positions at the same time, so that you don't pin every single political hope you have on an electoral cycle or on a law or on an organizational principle, for example, because there are always people that are left behind by those projects.
Great. And next one is for Ben from Jack Brown. Really interesting point he says about the culture in TV commissioning. I agree. I wasn't trying to differentiate. Do you think there are codes of behaviour and language in the contemporary left that are also exclusionary for working class people?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And yeah, I think there are for sure. Like, it's such a tricky one, this, because I mean, I'm sure we've all been in spaces where there's like a certain required knowledge of like the discourse, let's say, to be able to participate in those spaces. No, that's not necessarily a class. It's not necessarily a class issue, but I think it becomes a class issue when, in order to be able to kind of, participate, you've had to have gone to like a university, maybe have done like a master's degree. I mean, there is this narrative, I think, and I think it does exist in some parts. We've all seen it in some meetings for sure. I think though that's, I've also seen it being called out a lot. I've seen, I think people are like much more conscious of it now in a way. I think there's been like actually quite a lot of, I'm just like, even over the last 5 years, and I don't really know why. I mean, maybe it is partly to do with Corbynism and the fact that like for a long time, the left didn't necessarily need to try and even think about, it didn't want to think about electoral politics. That wasn't its, it wasn't really going down that route. And then suddenly with Corbyn, there was at least a part of the left that decided to go down a kind of more state-centric electoral route. And I think that has had obviously a lasting effect on every aspect of the left, even those who don't agree with parliamentary politics and don't want to organise within the state. I think maybe that like having a national conversation, like, being exposed to the press, being like having to kind of think through strategy a little bit more. I think in a way that has changed some of the discourse. And I guess I'd like to finish maybe just to talk about some of the other spaces, like for example, when you're doing trade union work in universities, where maybe these two things kind of really could come into conflict with each other. You have campaigns doing kind of justice for cleaners work, justice for cafe workers work is something we were doing at Greenwich this year, where you have middle class students with that discourse, let's say, and working class people who haven't been exposed to it. And I think the way in which you overcome it is by organizing together and like winning demands. And actually by doing that, you will become friends, and then you kind of have a party, and it no longer becomes that much of an issue, I'd say.
So final question is for Lola. So Rachel Westby says, you talk in the book about the power of imagination. So would you characterize liberal feminism as a failure of the imagination? And how can radical imagining be reintroduced into mainstream feminism?
This is a really great question. I would definitely characterize liberal feminism as a failure of the imagination. And I think about how the imagination and being able to make a claim for how the world should be, or laying out a vision for what the world should look like, has been central to radical movements, because that blueprint has never existed. It's always been beyond the realms of the given. It's always been beyond the realms of the thinkable. And so it's been easy to dismiss those visions as somehow utopian or somehow not possible. And I think that that's a lot how we talk about things like the abolition of prisons, the police state, the abolition of borders, for example. We talk about those things as kind of far-fetched ideas that would be nice, and not things that we might actively work towards in our lifetimes. I think in terms of when I think about what the purpose, in the book I talk about the imagination, and for me I think about the imagination as the thing that provides the impetus to act, so the impetus to organize. And in so many of the kind of groups that I'm part of, and in the communities I'm part of, that impetus to act, thinking of the imagination as this pool from which to draw on, that you constantly go back to, that sustains you, that replenishes you, that gives you new ideas about how to make your demands, etc. That's how we use it, and we really take it seriously in terms of using it as a method to maintain a sense of determination, to continue on in what might seem like very repetitive cycles of making demands, winning, losing, etc. I think it might be reintroduced. I think the task is not necessarily to attach it to a liberal feminism, because liberal feminism, by its definition, is devoid of that kind of imagination. But I think that there is a way that we might take the imagination seriously by thinking about how it has sustained movements before us and how it will continue to sustain movements after us. And I think that necessarily requires us to think about political work not as one long journey in one direction in a linear kind of fashion, to think about it always as kind of non-linear, happening loads in the same in lots of different directions at the same time, and also to think about it as something that is constant and ongoing. And yeah, I think Angela Davis has says this thing about it not being I went to a talk and she quoted Gramsci, like pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. And I think that that's really what the imagination demands of us, that we don't get so hung up that it's necessary for us to see our short or long-term goals recognized or realized in our lifetime, and that's the only thing that gives our work meaning. I think we do the work regardless, because we understand that in the small relations that we have with each other and in the ways that it changes our subjectivities and changes other people's subjectivities, that's political work in action. That's the work of transformation in action. And so yeah, and I think we can use the imagination, the framing of it in that way, as a tool to kind of reintroduce it into what feminism really is and what it can offer us in terms of not only personally but for our communities as well.
Great. So just to close, I'm going to ask you both a really, really annoying question. I'll go to Ben first. So ears peeled, Ben. Okay. If you had to describe and sell your book in 5 words, how would you do it?
Okay.
Get that hand out and count the words one by one.
Let's go for it. Oh God. Okay. Not billionaires, more solidarity, please.
Great, you've got one spare. You can use that.
Wait, was that one spare?
That was...
Oh, accessible.
You tried. So Lola, do you want to have a better go?
Radical feminist imagining made easy.
That's fantastic.
Oh, that's good.
That's wonderful.
That's really good.
So thank you both. It's been really, really enjoyable, and I love.
Thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So it's really lovely to have this conversation, and you said like so many great things. So thanks also to everybody for watching and for all of your great questions. Apologies, my stupid cat behind me. And I'm now going to leave over to Chris from Pluto, who has a lot more in tune. Not tonight, don't worry. Chris?
Thanks so much, Dawn. Yeah, just to wrap up, that was a really wonderful event. So thank you very much to the 3 of you for taking the time to come and do that. Yeah, both Feminism Interrupted and Split can be found on plutobooks.com, both in paperback and an ebook edition. And if you hurry, we're still offering, there's still a digital sale on the website as well for every book published up to the start of 2020. So do go and check that out and grab yourself a copy of Split and or Feminism Interrupted while you're there. If you've enjoyed this event, then do subscribe to the YouTube channel. We'll be back with another Radical May live stream later this week on Thursday. That's going to be a virtual book launch for Revenge Capitalism. So do have a look on our website for details of that as well. Yeah, that's it. Thanks to you all very much for joining us, and have a great evening, and we'll see you again soon.
See you later.